The faucet handle turned with a metallic squeak. Water rushed from the tap, clear and cold, splashing into a white porcelain sink. The sound echoed off tile walls in a concrete building surrounded by mesquite trees and barbed wire somewhere in West Texas. 32 Japanese soldiers stood in the doorway, barefoot, their uniforms still crusted with salt from the Pacific crossing. They stared at the running water as if witnessing a miracle or a trick. One man, Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto, stepped forward slowly. His hand hovered over the stream, trembling. When the water touched his palm, he jerked back, eyes wide. Another prisoner whispered in Japanese, his voice barely audible. "It comes from inside the wall." The American sergeant standing nearby didn't understand the words, but he recognized the expression. Confusion. Disbelief. Something deeper than fear. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He gestured toward the row of toilets along the opposite wall, each one gleaming white porcelain with a wooden seat. "Latrines," he said slowly, pointing. "You flush when you're done." The translator, a Nisei soldier from California, repeated the instructions in Japanese. But the prisoners didn't move. They had been taught that Americans were barbaric, that captivity meant death or worse. Yet here they stood in a room cleaner than any barracks they'd known, with water that flowed endlessly from pipes hidden in walls. When the sergeant demonstrated the flush, pulling the chain, the rush of water made several men jump backward. One prisoner's knees buckled. He sank to the cold tile floor, hands covering his face, shoulders shaking. The Americans thought perhaps he was ill, but the translator understood. The man was crying, not from shame or fear, but from the sudden, crushing realization that everything he had been told about the enemy was a lie. That night, Takeshi Yamamoto wrote in a small journal he'd managed to hide through capture. "Today I saw water come from a wall and disappear into the floor. The Americans call this normal. We call it impossible. I do not know which world I am living in anymore." The scene fades into the larger context of this forgotten chapter. Between 1942 and 1946, approximately 5,000 Japanese prisoners of war were held in camps across the continental United States. Most came from battles in the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Saipan, the Philippines. They arrived expecting execution, having been indoctrinated by imperial propaganda that surrender meant dishonor and death at enemy hands. Instead, they found themselves in places like Texas, far from the jungles and coral reefs where they'd fought. There were fences, yes, guards with rifles. But inside those fences existed something none of them had prepared for: order without cruelty, abundance without purpose, and technology so commonplace to Americans that they never thought to explain it. For men who had grown up in rural Japanese villages where water came from wells and waste, was collected in buckets, indoor plumbing wasn't just convenience, it was evidence of a civilization they couldn't comprehend. A system so advanced, so wealthy, that it piped water into buildings and made human waste disappear with the pull of a chain. One former prisoner, interviewed decades later by a historian, said simply, "When I saw the toilet flush for the first time, I understood why we lost the war. Not because of bombs or ships, but because of pipes. They had built a world we didn't know existed." The camera of memory pans across the red Texas earth, the shimmer of heat rising from distant mesas, the rhythmic clang of a windmill turning in the breeze. From that first day in the washroom, the Japanese prisoners began a journey few expected to survive. From certainty to doubt, from propaganda to truth. And it started not with words or weapons, but with the simple, invisible magic of running water. The transport ship had crossed the Pacific in darkness, its hull packed with men who believed they were sailing toward their deaths. Takeshi Yamamoto and the others had been captured on Saipan in the summer of 1944, after weeks of fighting that turned the island into a graveyard. Imperial officers had told them that capture was impossible, that true soldiers died rather than surrender. Yet here they were, alive, defeated, and drowning in shame. During the voyage, they were given rations, rice, canned meat, even crackers, The food was better than what they'd eaten in months of island warfare. Some refused to eat, certain it was poisoned. Others ate cautiously, waiting for sickness that never came. An American sailor had walked among them one evening, handing out cigarettes. He didn't speak Japanese, but he smiled. That smile was more confusing than any interrogation. When the ship docked in San Francisco, the prisoners were herded off in chains, blinking against sunlight that seemed too bright, too clean. The city rose before them, untouched by war. Buildings stood tall and whole. Cars moved through streets without craters. People walked freely, laughing, carrying bags of groceries. It looked nothing like the bombed, starving America their commanders had described. One prisoner whispered to Takeshi, "They lied to us." Takeshi didn't answer. He couldn't. The evidence was too overwhelming. From California, they were loaded onto trains that rolled eastward through landscapes none of them had imagined. Mountains gave way to deserts, deserts to plains. The train stopped in small towns where children waved from platforms, where farmers unloaded crates of vegetables, where everything looked abundant and ordinary. Japan, by 1944, was starving. Cities were ashes, supply lines were severed. Yet here, deep inside the enemy's homeland, life continued as if war were a distant rumor. The train reached Texas in late summer. When the doors slid open, the heat rushed in like a physical blow. Takeshi squinted against the glare. The landscape was flat, endless, dotted with cattle and strange wooden structures he would later learn were windmills. The guards wore wide-brimmed hats and spoke in slow drawls he couldn't understand. They were marched into a camp near the town of Seagerville, not far from Dallas. The compound was arranged in neat rows of wooden barracks, surrounded by a double fence of barbed wire. Watchtowers stood at each corner, but beyond the fences there were no ruins, no trenches, no signs of struggle, just open land stretching toward a horizon that seemed impossibly far away. At roll call, an American officer addressed them through the Nisei translator. "You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. You will work, you will eat, and you will be treated according to international law. You are not slaves, you will not be tortured, you will be given medical care." The words sounded reasonable. Too reasonable. Takeshi glanced at the other prisoners. Their faces showed the same confusion. This was not the America they had been trained to fear. That first night, they were given blankets, clean uniforms marked PW, and assigned bunks. The barracks had wooden floors, screened windows, and electric lights. When a guard flipped the switch and the bulbs blazed to life, several men gasped. Electricity. In a prison camp. Takeshi lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. Around him, men whispered nervously in the dark. "Why are they kind?" one asked. Another answered, "Maybe they're softening us before the executions." But Takeshi thought of the flushing toilet he'd seen earlier, the running water, the electric lights, and he wondered if kindness wasn't strategy at all. If maybe this was simply how the enemy lived, easily, abundantly, without thinking. Outside, a coyote howled somewhere in the Texas night. The sound was lonely and strange, like everything else in this place. And Takeshi closed his eyes, uncertain whether he was a prisoner or a witness, whether he had lost the war, simply discovered that there had never been a war he could win. Morning came with the sound of a bell, not a bugle. The Japanese prisoners rose stiffly, unsure of what to expect. In the Imperial Army, mornings began with harsh orders and physical punishment for any hesitation. Here, the American guards simply called chow time and gestured toward the mess hall. Inside, long wooden tables were arranged in rows. The smell of food, real food, filled the air. Rice, yes, but also scrambled eggs, toast, and something dark and aromatic the prisoners didn't recognize, coffee. Each man received a metal tray with portions that seemed impossibly large. Takeshi stared at his plate. It was more food than he'd seen in a single meal since before the war. Some prisoners ate slowly, still wary. Others devoured everything, their bodies overruling their minds. One man, a private named Kenji Sato, whispered, If they wanted us dead, they wouldn't waste this much food. It was a simple observation, but it carried weight. Slowly, carefully, the men began to accept that they might survive. After breakfast, they were divided into work details. Some were assigned to the camp kitchen, others to grounds maintenance, still others to a nearby farm that needed hands for cotton picking. The guards explained through the translator that they would be paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip, which could be used at the canteen for small luxuries: cigarettes, candy, writing paper. The concept of payment stunned them. Prisoners earning wages? It defied everything they'd been taught about captivity. In the imperial system, labor was duty, extracted through force and shame. Here, work was treated as a transaction. You give effort. You receive compensation. It was almost insulting in its simplicity. The camp itself was strange. There were rules, yes, but they were enforced without violence. Guards carried rifles but rarely raised their voices. Discipline was maintained through structure, not fear. Any guard who mistreated a prisoner faced punishment himself. This policy, explained to them during orientation, left the Japanese soldiers baffled. Accountability for those in power? It seemed like madness. Medical care was provided in a clean infirmary staffed by American doctors and nurses. When one prisoner developed an infected wound, he was treated with sulfur drugs and bandages. The doctor examined him thoroughly, explaining each step through the translator. The care was professional, almost respectful. The prisoner later told Takeshi, "He touched me like I was human." The statement hung in the air, heavy with implications. But it was the washroom that haunted them most. That first morning, they were shown the facilities: rows of sinks with running water, toilets that flushed, showers with adjustable temperature. For men who had grown up bathing in rivers or heated buckets, the concept was incomprehensible. Takeshi watched as one of the older prisoners, a farmer from Hokkaido, approached a sink. The man turned the handle slowly, as if expecting something terrible. When water poured out, clear and cold, he jerked his hand back. Then, cautiously, he tried again. This time he cupped his hands under the stream and brought the water to his face. He washed slowly, methodically, his expression shifting from fear to wonder. Later, Takeshi asked him what he was thinking. The farmer shook his head. "In my village, we carried water from the well. Every drop was work. Here, it comes from the wall like magic. How do you fight people who make magic normal?" That question echoed through the barracks. The prisoners began to see that American power wasn't built on discipline or ideology. It was built on infrastructure, on systems so efficient, so embedded in daily life, that Americans barely noticed them. Water flowed from pipes, electricity lit rooms, food arrived on trucks, waste disappeared. It was a kind of sorcery, and it worked without any individual needing to understand how. At night, lying in his bunk, Takeshi thought about the villages he'd known in Japan, the wells, the outhouses, the oil lamps. Simple, functional, but fragile. Here, everything was connected, invisible, automatic. The Americans had built a civilization where convenience was assumed, where basic needs were solved so thoroughly that people could focus on other things. He realized then that the war had been lost before it started. Not on battlefields, but in the factories and foundries and planning offices where America had decided that every building, every camp, every corner of its vast territory would have running water. Japan had fought with courage. America had fought with infrastructure. And infrastructure, Takeshi understood, was the ultimate weapon. The next morning, when the bell rang, he rose without hesitation. He washed his face at a sink where water came from the wall. He ate breakfast from a tray filled with food he hadn't earned. And he began, slowly, to accept that he was living in a world built by people who had solved problems he didn't even know existed. The day came when the prisoners were told to bathe, not in a river or a bucket, but in the showers. The word itself was new to most of them. When the guards led them toward the washroom building, Takeshi felt his stomach tighten. Rumors had spread through the barracks. Whispers that this was how the Americans killed prisoners, gas chambers disguised as bathing facilities. The stories had come from imperial propaganda, tales of enemy barbarism meant to prevent surrender. The washroom was a long concrete structure with high windows that let in slanted bars of Texas sunlight. Inside, the air smelled of soap and damp tile. Rows of shower heads lined the walls, metal pipes disappearing into the ceiling. The floor had drains in a grid pattern, dark openings that seemed to lead nowhere. The American sergeant in charge gestured for the men to undress. Through the translator, he said, simply, "Strip down, wash up, you'll get clean uniforms after." His tone was casual, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. But to the Japanese prisoners, it felt like a trap. Takeshi exchanged glances with Kenji. The younger man's face had gone pale. Around them, others hesitated, clutching their uniforms like armor. One man began to pray silently, his lips moving without sound. Another started to shake, his hands trembling so badly he couldn't unbutton his shirt. The sergeant frowned, confused by the delay. The Nisei translator stepped forward, speaking rapidly in Japanese. "It's safe. It's just water. They do this every week. Look." He walked over to one of the shower heads and turned the handle. Water burst from the fixture, spraying down in a wide arc. Several prisoners flinched. One stumbled backward, nearly falling. The translator stood under the stream, fully clothed, letting it soak through his uniform. "See? Just water. You're safe." Slowly, hesitantly, the men began to undress. They moved like people approaching an executioner, each step heavy with dread. When they stood naked under the shower heads, the sergeant called, "Turn the handles. Hot and cold. Adjust to your liking." The first man to try it was the old farmer from Hokkaido. He reached up, turned the handle, and water cascaded over him. His eyes went wide. He touched the stream, adjusted the temperature, and suddenly his shoulders began to shake. Takeshi thought he was having a seizure, but then he realized the man was laughing, a strange, breathless laugh that bordered on hysteria. Others turned their handles. Water poured down, warm and abundant. The sound filled the room, a roar of pressure and flow that seemed impossible. Takeshi turned his own shower on and felt the water hit his skin. It was hot, not lukewarm, but genuinely hot, as if someone had heated it just for him. In Japan, hot baths were luxuries, prepared with effort and fuel. Here, hot water came from a wall. One of the younger prisoners, a boy barely 18, sank to his knees under the spray. He pressed his hands to his face and began to sob. Not quietly, but in great, heaving gasps. The guards exchanged uncertain looks. The translator knelt beside the boy, speaking softly. After a moment, he stood and told the sergeant, "He thought he was going to die. He's crying because he didn't." The sergeant removed his cap, running a hand through his hair. He looked at the rows of naked, weeping men and said quietly, "Jesus Christ! What did they tell these boys?" The Nisei translator met his eyes. "That we're monsters." For a long time, the only sound was water. The prisoners stood under the showers, some washing, others simply standing still, letting the stream pour over them as if it could wash away more than dirt. Takeshi lathered his hair with the soap they'd been given. It smelled clean, medicinal, nothing like the harsh lye soap he'd known in the army. He scrubbed his skin until it tingled, and, for the first time in months, he felt something close to human. When they emerged from the washroom, their hair damp, their new uniforms crisp and clean, several men were smiling. Not with joy, exactly, but with a kind of stunned relief. They had passed through the room they feared most and found only water. Only kindness. Only evidence that the world they'd been told about was fiction. That evening, Takeshi sat on his bunk and stared at his hands. They were clean, cleaner than they'd been since childhood. He thought about the shower, the endless flow of hot water, the drains that swallowed everything without effort. And he wrote in his journal, "Today I stood under water that came from nowhere and went nowhere. The Americans do not think this is strange. That is how I know we have lost. Not because they beat us, but because they live in a world where miracles are ordinary. Around him, the barracks filled with quiet conversation. Men spoke of the showers, the soap, the strange comfort of being clean. And for the first time since capture, if you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Takeshi heard something he hadn't expected. Hope. Not hope for victory or return, but hope that survival might not mean suffering, that captivity might not mean death, that the enemy might not be the enemy after all. Outside, the Texas sun set in bands of orange and purple. Somewhere, a radio played swing music, and the sound drifted across the camp like a promise. The war was still happening, thousands of miles away across an ocean. But here, in this small corner of Texas, among men who had learned to fear water from walls, a different kind of battle was being fought. A battle not of weapons, but of understanding. And slowly, one shower at a time, it was being won. The work details began in earnest the following week. Each morning after breakfast, the prisoners were divided into groups and assigned tasks. Some worked in the camp kitchen, peeling potatoes and washing dishes. Others tended the vegetable gardens that supplied fresh produce for the mess hall. A few were sent to nearby ranches and farms where labor was scarce due to the war effort. Takeshi was assigned to a cotton farm about 10 miles from the camp. He and 15 other prisoners rode in the back of a military truck, guarded by 2 young soldiers who couldn't have been much older than 20. The guards carried rifles, but they rested the weapons casually against the truck bed, more concerned with keeping their balance on the bumpy dirt roads than with watching the prisoners. When they arrived at the farm, Takeshi saw rows of cotton stretching toward the horizon, white bowls bursting from dried plants like snow. The farmer, a weathered man named Mr. Dawson, greeted them with a nod. He wore denim overalls and a sweat-stained hat, and he spoke in a thick accent the prisoners couldn't parse. But his gestures were clear. Pick the cotton. Fill the sacks. Work steady. The labor was back-breaking. The Texas sun burned white-hot, and the cotton bowls were sharp, cutting into fingers that weren't yet calloused. But Takeshi noticed something strange. Mr. Dawson worked alongside them. The owner of the farm, a man who could have simply given orders, bent his back in the same rows, filling his own sack with the same cotton. At midday, the farmer's wife arrived in a pickup truck loaded with lunch. She had brought sandwiches, thick slices of bread filled with meat and cheese, along with jars of cold, sweet tea. She smiled at the prisoners as she handed out the food, saying something in English that sounded kind. The guards translated loosely. She says you boys are working hard. Eat up. The prisoners sat in the shade of the truck, unwrapping the sandwiches with careful hands. Takeshi bit into his and tasted ham, real meat, layered with crisp lettuce, and something tangy he would later learn was mustard. In Japan, meat had become a memory. Here, it was packed into a farm worker's lunch without ceremony. Kenji leaned over and whispered, "They feed their prisoners better than our officers ate." After lunch, Mr. Dawson showed them how to use a mechanical cotton picker, a massive contraption that rolled through the fields on steel wheels, its spinning drums pulling cotton from the plants with mechanical efficiency. The prisoners watched in silence as the machine did in minutes what would have taken them hours by hand. One man muttered, "No wonder they won." The work continued through the afternoon. When the sun finally dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet, Mr. Dawson paid them their wages. 80 cents each in camp scrip, crisp paper bills that felt strange in their calloused hands. The farmer shook each man's hand as he paid them, his grip firm, his eyes direct. It was a gesture of equals, laborer to laborer, and it unsettled Takeshi more than any insult could have. On the ride back to camp, the prisoners were quiet. The truck bounced along dirt roads, passing farmhouses with electric lights glowing in windows, passing fields where cattle grazed peacefully, passing a world untouched by war. One of the guards offered cigarettes, and several men accepted. They smoked in silence, watching the Texas landscape fade into dusk. That night, Takeshi used part of his wages at the camp canteen. He bought a Coca-Cola, the first he'd ever seen. The bottle was cold, beaded with condensation. When he twisted off the cap, the fizz made him jump. He took a cautious sip and felt the bubbles burn his throat, the sweetness almost overwhelming. Around him, other prisoners made similar purchases. Candy bars, chewing gum, writing paper, small luxuries that in Japan would have been unimaginable during wartime. Kenji bought a postcard showing the Texas State Capitol building in Austin. He stared at it for a long moment, then said quietly, "I want to send this home." But what would I say? That the enemy lives in a paradise? That we fought people who have machines to pick cotton, water that comes from walls? Takeshi had no answer. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. The camp had a small library stocked with books in both English and Japanese. There were classes where prisoners could learn English, carpentry, even basic mechanics. The guards encouraged education, as if knowledge was something to be shared rather than controlled. The infirmary was stocked with medicines that didn't exist in Japan: sulfur drugs, penicillin, aspirin. When a prisoner developed pneumonia, he was treated with a level of care that stunned everyone. The American doctor, a middle-aged man from Houston, sat by the sick man's bedside, monitoring his temperature, adjusting his medication. He explained everything through the translator, patiently answering questions about how the drugs worked, why rest was important, what signs to watch for. In the Imperial Army, one prisoner told Takeshi, if you got sick, you were weak. Here, if you get sick, they heal you. The difference wasn't subtle. It was a fundamental shift in how human life was valued. In the system they'd known, individuals were expendable, tools to be used until broken. Here, even prisoners, even the enemy, were treated as if their survival mattered. The turning point came in October of 1944, when the camp commander announced that prisoners could send letters home through the Red Cross. Each man was given paper, an envelope, and permission to write one letter per month. The only restriction was length and the removal of any military information. Takeshi sat on his bunk that evening, pen in hand, staring at blank paper. What could he say? How could he explain what he'd seen without sounding mad or traitorous? Finally, he began to write. Dear Mother and Father, I am alive and well. I am held in a camp in a place called Texas, in the center of America. I cannot describe everything I have seen here, but I will try. The Americans treat us according to international law. We are given food, 3 meals every day, more than I ate as a soldier. We work, but we are paid. We are allowed to buy small things at a store. We have electric lights and clean water that comes from pipes in the walls. He paused, reading what he'd written. It sounded like fantasy. He continued, I know this will be hard to believe, but I must tell you the truth. The America we were told about does not exist. They do not torture prisoners. They do not starve us. They have built a country where even captives are given dignity. I do not know what this means for the war or for Japan, but I know that I have been lied to. We all have. He signed his name, folded the letter, and sealed it. He didn't know if it would reach his family. Mail from Japan had stopped months ago, but writing the words felt important, like bearing witness to a truth that needed to be recorded. Other prisoners wrote similar letters. Some were cautious, afraid of saying too much. Others were blunt, describing the abundance, the machinery, the casual ease with which Americans lived. One man wrote simply, Father, we fought a country that has forgotten how to be poor. That is why we lost. The letters were collected, censored by American officers who removed any sensitive information and sent through Red Cross channels. Months later, a few responses arrived. Brief notes from families, carefully worded to pass Japanese censors. We are glad you are alive. The homeland is strong. Victory is certain. The words rang hollow now, propaganda written by people who didn't know the truth. By the winter of 1944, the Japanese prisoners had settled into a routine. Wake at dawn, breakfast, Work details: lunch, more work, evening meal, free time, lights out. It was structured, predictable, almost peaceful. The fear that had gripped them during those first weeks had faded, replaced by a strange acceptance. They learned English phrases from the guards. Thank you. Good morning. How are you? Simple exchanges that made daily life smoother. Some guards learned Japanese words in return. Arigato. Ohayo. Genki desu ka? The language barrier became porous, communication happening through gestures, laughter, and shared labor. One cold December morning, the camp woke to frost on the barbed wire. The prisoners had never seen frost before, coming from a country where winter meant rain, not ice. They stood outside, watching their breath fog in the air, marveling at how the grass crunched under their boots. The guards brought out extra blankets and hot coffee. That evening, they announced that Christmas was coming, and there would be a special meal. The prisoners didn't understand Christmas, but they understood celebration. When the day arrived, the mess hall was decorated with pine branches and red ribbons. The tables were covered in white cloth, and the meal was extraordinary. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, rolls, and apple pie. Takeshi stared at his plate, overwhelmed. This was how the Americans celebrated even during wartime, with abundance, with joy, with a feast that didn't apologize for itself. Around him, prisoners ate in stunned silence, occasionally looking at each other as if to confirm they were seeing the same thing. After the meal, one of the guards brought out a harmonica and played a slow, mournful tune. Another guard joined in with a guitar. The music filled the hall, and for a moment the war disappeared. Some prisoners hummed along, not knowing the words but feeling the melody. It was a moment of shared humanity, fragile and unexpected. That night, Takeshi wrote in his journal, "Today the enemy gave us a feast. They did not have to. We are prisoners, defeated, worthless in the eyes of our own country. But they fed us as if we mattered. I do not understand this. In the imperial system, kindness is weakness. Here, kindness is strength. It breaks us more effectively than any bullet." The new year arrived with little fanfare. 1945 began quietly, the war in the Pacific intensifying, even as the prisoners in Texas lived in a bubble of routine and relative comfort. News filtered in through guards and newspapers. American forces were island hopping, drawing closer to Japan. Cities were being bombed. The Imperial Army was losing ground. The prisoners absorbed this information with mixed emotions. Loyalty to their homeland warred with the reality they lived every day. They wanted Japan to survive, but they could no longer believe in Japanese victory. The math was too clear, the evidence too overwhelming. In February, a Red Cross inspector visited the camp. He interviewed prisoners privately, asking about conditions, treatment, food, medical care. Takeshi told him the truth. "We are treated well, better than we deserve." The inspector nodded, making notes, and moved on. Later, Takeshi learned that American camps were inspected regularly, that international law was followed not just in word but in practice. It was another small revelation in a series of revelations. Spring came to Texas, with wildflowers and warm breezes. The prisoners planted a garden at the edge of the camp, growing vegetables they would eat in summer. It was a strange thing, planning for a future they couldn't see. But the act of planting, of nurturing life, felt important. It gave them purpose beyond survival. The work details continued. Takeshi became skilled at cotton picking, his hands tough and quick. Mr. Dawson began to greet him by name, a small acknowledgement that meant more than the farmer probably realized. One afternoon, after a particularly long day, Mr. Dawson handed Takeshi a cold Coca-Cola and said, "You're a good worker." The translator repeated it, and Takeshi bowed slightly, unsure how else to respond. At night, the prisoners gathered in the barracks and talked. About home, about the war, about what they would do when it ended. Some believed they would be sent back to Japan, though the thought filled them with dread. What would they return to? Ruins? Shame? A country that had taught them to fear surrender more than death? Others wondered if they would be allowed to stay in America. It seemed impossible. But so had everything else. One man joked darkly, "Maybe they'll let us keep the plumbing." The others laughed, but the joke had weight. The plumbing, the electricity, the abundance. These weren't just conveniences. They were symbols of a civilization that had solved problems Japan was still struggling with. In April of 1945, news arrived that stunned everyone. President Roosevelt was dead. The camp fell silent. Even the prisoners felt the weight of it. Roosevelt had been the face of American leadership, the enemy commander-in-chief. But in the months of captivity, they had learned that Americans mourned their leaders, that democracy meant the people chose who ruled them, that power could transfer peacefully. The guards lowered the flag to half-staff. Some of the prisoners, unsure of what to do, bowed their heads in respect. It was a strange moment, enemies acknowledging loss together. Takeshi thought about the emperor, untouchable and divine in Japanese ideology. But here, the president was a man, mourned like any man, and the country continued without chaos. May brought the news everyone had been waiting for and dreading. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. In the camp, prisoners and guards gathered around radios, listening to broadcasts. The implications were clear. America could now focus all its power on Japan. The end was coming. Takeshi sat outside that evening, watching the sun set over Texas plains. He thought about his family in Kyoto, about the cities being bombed, about the soldiers still fighting on islands whose names he'd never heard. He wondered if any of it had ever mattered, if the courage and sacrifice had been in service of something real, or just a lie told by men who didn't care about truth. A guard walked by, noticed him sitting alone, and paused. "You okay?" the guard asked. Takeshi didn't understand all the words, but he understood the tone. Concern. He nodded. The guard sat down beside him, offering a cigarette. They smoked together in silence, two men who should have been enemies, watching the same sunset. When summer arrived, the heat intensified. The work slowed during the hottest hours, and prisoners rested in the shade, drinking water that came endlessly from pipes. They had stopped marveling at it, stopped questioning. The miracle had become normal, just as it was for the Americans. In August, the unthinkable happened. A new weapon, a single bomb that destroyed an entire city. Hiroshima first, then Nagasaki. The broadcasts described devastation beyond comprehension. Prisoners wept openly. Guards stood silent, unsure what to say. The translator tried to explain what the radio announcer was reporting, but words failed. Takeshi sat on his bunk, head in hands, trying to process it. The weapon was called an atomic bomb. It split atoms, whatever that meant, and released power equal to thousands of conventional bombs. It was the ultimate expression of American technology, the inevitable conclusion of a civilization that could pipe water into buildings and make waste disappear with a chain pull. Days later, the emperor's voice came over the radio, thin, reedy, almost inhuman. He announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. The prisoners sat in stunned silence. Some cried. Others stared at nothing. Takeshi felt empty, hollowed out. It was finished. The camp commander addressed them the next day. "The war is over. You are no longer combatants. You will remain here until arrangements can be made for repatriation. Until then, you will be treated as before, with dignity, with respect." In the following weeks, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Guards became friendlier, less formal. The fences remained, but they felt less like barriers. Prisoners were allowed more freedom within the camp, permitted to organize cultural events, to practice calligraphy, to play Japanese games. One evening, the guards organized a baseball game between themselves and a team of prisoners. It was absurd and wonderful. American soldiers teaching Japanese soldiers how to pitch, to bat, to slide into bases. Everyone laughed when someone missed the ball or ran the wrong direction. For a few hours, the war truly ended. Not in a treaty or a surrender, but in play. Takeshi stood on the sidelines, watching, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Joy. Simple, uncomplicated joy. He thought about the boy he'd been before the war, before propaganda and marching and the certainty that dying for the emperor was the highest honor. That boy had liked games, had liked laughter, had believed the world could be kind. In September, letters began arriving from Japan. Takeshi received one from his mother. The handwriting was shaky, the paper thin, and torn at the edges. Dear Takeshi, we survived. Your father is alive. The city is damaged, but we are rebuilding. Come home when you can. We miss you. He read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. They were alive. His family had survived the bombs, the fires, the starvation. It was more than he had dared hope. That night, he showed the letter to Kenji, who had received nothing. Kenji read it silently, then handed it back. You're lucky, he said quietly. Hold on to that. The process of repatriation took months. Paperwork, logistics, ships. The prisoners waited, caught between worlds. Some were eager to return home, to see families, to rebuild. Others were terrified, unsure what awaited them in a defeated Japan, uncertain if they would be branded as cowards for surviving. In December of 1945, the order finally came. They would begin boarding ships in January. The prisoners packed their few belongings. Takeshi folded his clean uniforms, tucked his journal into his bag, and looked around the barracks one last time. This place had been a prison, yes, but it had also been a school, a place where he learned that the world was larger and stranger than he'd imagined. On the day of departure, Mr. Dawson came to the camp. He found Takeshi among the prisoners waiting to board trucks and pressed something into his hand. A small pocket knife, worn but functional. For the road, the farmer said through the translator. You were a good worker. Good luck. Takeshi bowed deeply, unable to speak. The knife was a simple thing, but it represented something profound. Recognition. Respect. A gift between equals. He slipped it into his pocket and climbed onto the truck. As the convoy rolled away from the camp, Takeshi looked back. The barracks, the mess hall, the washroom with its impossible plumbing, all of it fading into the Texas landscape. He thought about the first day, standing in that tiled room, staring at water flowing from a wall, believing he was about to die. He had died, in a way. The soldier who believed in the emperor's divinity, who thought Americans were monsters, who saw surrender as the ultimate shame. That man was gone. In his place was someone different, someone who had learned that strength could be gentle, that enemies could show kindness, that indoor plumbing was just the beginning of a world he'd never imagined. The ship that carried them across the Pacific was crowded and slow. Prisoners filled the hold, sleeping on bunks, eating simple meals, waiting. The voyage took weeks. Takeshi stood on deck when they finally sighted Japan, the coastline emerging from morning mist. It looked smaller than he remembered. Frailer. When they docked, the prisoners were processed and released. Takeshi made his way to Kyoto, traveling through a landscape of ruins. Cities were blackened skeletons. People moved through rubble with hollow eyes. Food was scarce. Everything was scarce. The abundance of Texas felt like a dream, distant and impossible. He found his family's house, partially standing, patched with scrap wood and tarps. His mother opened the door and fell into his arms, sobbing. His father stood behind her, older, thinner, but alive. They held each other without words, the war hanging between them like smoke. That night, over a sparse meal of rice and pickles, his mother asked, "What was it like? In America?" Takeshi didn't know how to answer. He thought about the plumbing, the food, the baseball game, the kindness. Finally, he said, "It was not what we were told." His father nodded slowly. Nothing was. In the years that followed, Takeshi rebuilt his life. He married, had children, worked as a mechanic. Japan rose from the ashes, adopting American systems, American technology. Indoor plumbing became common. Electricity spread. The abundance that had once seemed impossible became ordinary. But Takeshi never forgot Texas. He kept the pocket knife in his desk drawer, a reminder of a time when the world turned upside down, when water from a wall taught him more about power than any weapon, when the enemy showed him mercy and, in doing so, won a war that had already been decided. Decades later, a journalist interviewing former prisoners of war asked Takeshi what he remembered most about captivity. He thought for a long moment, then said, "The toilet. The first time I saw it flush, I understood everything. Not just why we lost the war, but what we were fighting against. We were fighting people who had solved problems we didn't know existed. Who built systems that worked invisibly? Who believed that even prisoners deserved clean water and dignity? That was the real weapon, not the bombs. The plumbing." The journalist wrote it down, probably thinking it was a joke or an old man's confusion. But Takeshi was serious. He had learned in that Texas washroom what no propaganda could teach. That civilization wasn't about courage or ideology. It was about infrastructure, about making life easier, cleaner, better, about building systems that lifted everyone, even your enemies. He kept that lesson for the rest of his life. And when he told his grandchildren about the war, he didn't talk about battles or glory. He talked about a room with sinks and toilets, about water that came from walls and disappeared into floors, about the day he learned that the world was bigger than Japan had taught him, and that kindness was the strongest weapon of all. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.